ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hey, Jules and Jez here, and we love news. We read it, we drink it, we work in the media, but it can be pretty overwhelming.
So this week on Not Stupid, how do we stay focused? You can find us on the ABC Listen app.
Imagine for a moment that house prices fell by 20%. That's what's happened over the past couple of years in some cities in New Zealand. So, could Australia do with a housing crash? And what would that mean for all of us? The New Zealand house price slump may have helped some people get into the property market, but it's left homeowners like Bodine in a financial bind.
We bought in the high and the interest rates have dropped a bit, so that's helped, but the value of the house has dropped significantly.
Now they feel trapped.
Me and my partner, we tried to get another property, but since we've lost over $100,000 on our place over a 3-year period, dropped us out of anything that we would kind of swap this for.
The house price crash only happened because of job losses and a recession taking hold. Is the medicine worth the pain? I'm Sam Hawley from ABC News Daily. This is Housing Hostages, Episode 4, Time for a Crash. Today, our business editor, Michael Janda, explains how a shock wave would ripple through the economy if the bubble bursts. Hi, Michael. Welcome back. We've had some really good discussions up until this point, of course, about the housing crisis and how we landed in it and why we landed in it. But let's today start looking at how we could break free from it. It's like we're in jail.
Yes, but we don't have a get out of jail free card.
We know there are a lot of Australians who own homes who wouldn't actually want this, what I'm about to say, but there are also a growing number of pretty disenfranchised people who think a housing crash might not be such a bad thing.
There's a huge amount of desperation, Sam, and there's a lot of really intelligent young people out there in Australia, and a lot of them write into me when I write articles about the housing market saying, come on, let's bring it on, take the pain now, clear out the system and let's just start again.
Yeah, all right. So to get a good understanding of what that would look like, let's jump on a plane and head to New Zealand. Well, not literally, of course, because we don't have the funding for that. But there is a recession happening there right now, isn't there?
There is, and there's certainly a lot of Kiwis who've headed the other way on a plane.
Yes.
Barring the budget to fly over to New Zealand, I contacted Brad Olsen, an economist who runs the Wellington-based consultancy Infometrics. I've spoken to him many times before about the New Zealand economy, and I wanted to find out what he thought of the housing market over there at the moment and the recession that New Zealand has really been in the grips of for about 18 months.
I'm a younger person. I rent myself, and I can tell you the number of friends that I've had that have either moved overseas because there's no job opportunities or have lost their jobs, particularly in Wellington in the last year or so. Those are pretty harrowing stories, and I think brings a very human element to what's often just a number in a spreadsheet.
Some of his friends, even who've kept jobs, are struggling to hang on to their houses. They're struggling to pay increased interest rates, which is what's caused the recession over there.
A friend of mine bought her first house right in the middle of that big house price spike around sort of November 2021. And at one point last year, she needed to find an extra $60,000 or so more than she already had to pay the mortgage in a year. And at the same time, her house had lost about $350,000 worth of value.
Yeah, that's really, really difficult for a lot of people over there. So just tell me about the numbers then. How bad is the recession itself?
Yeah, so Sam, the numbers tell us the recession is really severe in New Zealand.
You know, we've seen tens of thousands more people become unemployed. I think at last count it was sitting around 33,000 just over the last 12 months. So that's difficult. That's real people's jobs who are now completely gone. They've got no other options. And there are a lot more people currently looking for jobs than there are jobs available. And so the prospects for those who have lost employment aren't great to get it back.
Stats New Zealand estimates that more than 150,000 Kiwis who are looking for a job can't find one, and it's a small country over there.
Yeah.
And you've also seen from this contraction in GDP and the rise in joblessness, a lot of New Zealanders moving to Australia, record numbers. Looking at some of the other numbers, Sam, New Zealand's economy shrank 1% in the September quarter. That's huge. And that followed on from a 1.1% fall the quarter before. And those are the kind of GDP numbers that we saw back when Australia had the recession we had to have in the early 1990s.
Sounds like a real mess. So what actually happened to land New Zealand in this rather large bind?
Like Australia and much of the developed world, inflation really took off in New Zealand towards the end of COVID. As they started reopening their economy, prices started going through the roof. Unlike Australia, though, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand acted very quickly and very aggressively in hiking interest rates to try and bring that inflation under control.
Suck it in, New Zealand. There could be some collective belt tightening on the way following a supersized interest rate hike from the Reserve Bank.
The RBNZ says high interest rates are now limiting spending and inflation pressure.
And New Zealand's cash rate jumped from a record low of 0.25% and it reached a peak of 5.5% by May 2023. And that peak is more than a percentage point higher than Australia's peak cash rate. Not only that, the peak New Zealand rate stayed in place for more than a year before the RBNZ started cutting rates only in August of last year.
3 weeks after the US Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 0.5%, the Kiwis have followed suit. We've now seen rate cuts by the US, New Zealand, the UK, Europe, Canada.
So they were quick to hike rates. They kept rates at very high levels for quite a long time, and arguably they were far too slow to start bringing them down again.
Wow. So New Zealand's equivalent of our Reserve Bank got it wrong.
At the time, a lot of economists here were lauding the Reserve Bank of New Zealand for being aggressive and fighting inflation and arguing they'd done a much better job than the Reserve Bank of Australia. But hey, Australia's not in recession. Our unemployment rate's still 4%, and that's after absorbing probably 50 or 60,000 Kiwis.
All right, so how is all of this then, Michael, affecting New Zealand's housing market?
Well, CoreLogic's numbers, and they operate over there too, they show property prices have crashed by almost 18% from their post-pandemic peak.
Oh my gosh.
Now, those falls have been even bigger in New Zealand's two biggest cities, Auckland and Wellington. Both of them are down more than 20% from the peak, so that is a crash.
Sure is. Gosh.
With such a lot of people trying to sell their house at the moment, it's a further sort of keeping pressure down on prices across the market, and that means that our general expectation is that house prices don't go all that much up the next couple of years, despite the fact that interest rates have started to come down.
Now, I'm sure there'd be some people who'll be able to take advantage of that and get into the property market, especially now that interest rates are falling as well. But New Zealand house prices, even with that fall, are only basically back to where they were before the pandemic, and that was hardly cheap. Aside from that, those people who are getting into the market, they're buying off someone, and many of those people are struggling and being forced out. So for every winner, there's a loser.
Some people that bought their houses at the peak of the market, they got very low interest rates. You know, they might have only been paying 2, maybe 2.5% per annum on their interest rate on their mortgage, but they bought at the top of the market and now they've effectively got negative equity. If they sold their houses today, they would get less back in than they originally paid for and less than their loan amount is.
Wow, it just sounds awful, Michael. And For some people who recently bought these homes, it must be just so incredibly difficult. But I suppose there are young people also, on the flip side, that are actually cheering for this drop in house prices. There are silver linings for them.
Yeah, look, and one of the big silver linings out of all of this, according to Brad Olson, is the change in attitude to property investment.
There was talk in New Zealand and probably in Australia as well that houses were, funnily enough, an investment as safe as houses. They couldn't go wrong. They couldn't lose money. They were just a sort of golden ticket to financial millionaire status. Whereas now in New Zealand, there's this view that actually housing is a more competitive, a slightly riskier than first thought investment option. Not saying it's a bad one, but it takes a little bit more wit about you than just thinking it's a golden-plated investment for the future.
So Brad Olson sounds pretty optimistic that there will be some good out of this.
Yes, Sam, he doesn't even think the recession is going to end up being all that painful.
We're certainly not expecting this as a particularly deep, prolonged recession. It's a bit of a reset point for the New Zealand economy after effectively having too much activity and too much stimulus through the last couple of years that generated inflation. We've then got rid of inflation by bringing the pace of economic activity down a touch. Now we need to sort of recalibrate and figure out where the new normal is. And
he thinks that now the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is cutting interest rates, the economy will quickly rebound, and that by later this year, New Zealand's economy will be on a more sustainable growth path, but with property prices at a more realistic level.
Now there's more of an expectation that house prices will be broadly flat to slightly up, but nowhere near the pace that they were before. And that's really changing how people consider housing as both an investment, but also something that's available to households to buy instead of rent.
Now, I have to say, I think that's a pretty optimistic view.
Right.
It reflects a particular train of economic thought that recessions are necessary to cleanse capitalist economies. If you like, they're the kind of fire that clears out the deadwood and allows sunlight to come through. But there are other economists who are very deeply worried about what happens to the labour market, and that line of thinking is that you get a lot of young people who leave school or university, they can't break into the jobs market, and then their skills atrophy while they're sitting unemployed. And then they become long-term unemployed. At the other end of the age spectrum, you also get the middle-aged and older people who get made redundant in these recessions and then find it hard to find another job, and some of them get pushed into involuntary early retirement. In New Zealand's case, because they can come here without a visa, we've already seen a record brain drain of Kiwis looking for better opportunities here, and that in turn may limit the future skilled labour supply and potential for economic growth in New Zealand.
Time will tell us how this recession, Michael, will impact New Zealand in the long term, but there have been other recessions in other similar economies that we can look to understand the long-term impacts. One of the most infamous is in Ireland, which crashed during the global financial crisis in 2008.
An estimated 100,000 people took to the streets of Dublin over the weekend to protest against the government's austerity plans.
This weekend, European Union officials have been in Dublin trying to convince the Irish government to accept a bailout.
A programme of assistance for Ireland totalling €85 billion has been agreed.
European finance ministers have finally agreed to a $117 billion package to save Ireland from defaulting on its international debts.
All this to pay for the mistakes of Ireland's banks. They overindulged on bad loans. It's Irish workers who are now left with the hangover.
So remind me, what happened over there?
Yes, Sam, Ireland was a total disaster zone.
Okay.
It was one of the worst wipeouts of the global financial crisis, up there not only with the US, but Spain, Iceland, and those other economies that just completely collapsed. I spoke to economist Colm Harmon about what it was like living in Ireland when everything was falling apart around him.
The shock in the Irish economy was quite extraordinary. I remember in a 3-month period, I think between January and March, seeing my net income drop by 25%.
He was working as a university professor. He was on a pretty good wage, but that wage got cut basically overnight in 2009.
What was really striking was seeing the way in which rural Ireland and the smaller towns and cities outside of Dublin became decimated.
When you look at the broader figures, unemployment peaked at 15% in Ireland.
So the question is, what happened to home ownership as a result of this crash then?
Yes, well, Colm was saying on the ground in Ireland, you had people like in the US at the time handing over their keys to the bank.
The great metaphor of that period were the so-called ghost estates, half-finished housing projects that were just left idle, where folks were sort of, handing in their keys to the bank and saying, we're done.
Now, between the peak in early 2007 and the trough in prices in about 2012, Irish home prices literally halved. So that was one of the biggest housing crashes we have ever seen.
Wow.
The decline was even bigger in the capital, Dublin, where prices fell as much as 56%. Now, in terms of home ownership, though, it also fell. So even though the crash made the average home 50% cheaper, most people in Ireland simply weren't able to get a loan to buy those cheaper houses, possibly because many of them didn't have a job.
Yeah, right. And also their wages had been slashed.
Exactly.
My gosh. Okay. So that was, though, 15 years ago. So what's the recovery process looked like in Ireland? Are people generally better or worse off now?
Well, as Colm explains, Ireland was in deep trouble for about 5 or 6 years, but then the economy did start to recover.
You still have a housing market that has been very sluggish to respond in terms of supply, land banks that are still tied up in failed property deals that haven't been freed up to realise. And because the economy is sort of doing pretty well, certainly by European contexts, with inward migration again, we're seeing a lot of those pressures in terms of supply challenges, but also pressures in terms of the political challenges around immigration and so on.
So as Colm describes it, you had basically this lost decade where people were leaving the country, you had falling wages, you had negative economic growth, falling house prices, falling household wealth. But once that turned around and the economy started growing again, you're going back to the same old problems that Ireland had before, an inflow of people without the housing to meet that inflow, particularly in Dublin.
If you think of a sort of a pretty average, 3-bedroom semi-D in a suburb in Dublin is probably up around the sort of $700,000, $800,000 mark.
And are you talking Australian dollars there?
Yeah, in the Australian dollars. And if you look at the other end of that, in other parts of the country, it's a quarter of that. So very unequal picture.
And that's getting back to the price levels and above that they saw before the crash. And along with it, the creaking infrastructure of overcrowded cities, full hospitals, and, those huge waiting queues to get a rental apartment in Dublin, which could be hundreds long.
Not to mention the cost of a pint of Guinness.
Yes, well, that's right. I think there might be revolution in Ireland if the pint of Guinness became too expensive.
I think that's right. All right, so that's amazing though. They went from a crisis of overbuilding then back to a housing shortage.
Yep. The median dwelling in Dublin City is €450,000 and prices in the more sought-after areas of Dublin are at €660,000, which is about 1.1 million Australian dollars. So very much getting towards Australian level city home prices.
All right, so Michael, let's get back on that plane and come back to Australia. How do we look compared to countries like Ireland, New Zealand and the US, which all have a housing crisis?
In a word, we look worse. If you look at the metrics, our houses are more expensive relative to our incomes. Our household debt levels are much higher than any of these countries when their property markets blew up. Now, cast back, we met Jared Minack in the last episode. He was working as the global developed markets strategist at the huge US investment bank Morgan Stanley during that US housing boom and bust back in the early 2000s.
It occurred at levels that Americans thought were very expensive house prices, but by Australian standards, the peak of the US housing bubble, house prices were cheaper than they are in Adelaide at the moment. One of the unique features of the Aussie housing market is how it's almost impossible to find anything cheap. If you go to a place like New York, if you want to commute 45 minutes to New Jersey or Connecticut, you can find relatively cheap housing. And yet if you're in Sydney and you want to commute 2 hours to Wollongong, you're still paying average house price to income 8 or 9 times. If you want to go to Newcastle, it's even more expensive.
Okay, so with prices so high all around Australia, could we be heading towards a housing crash of our own?
Look, Sam, it's certainly a risk. AMP's chief economist, Shane Oliver, finds Australia's houses in capital cities are overvalued by more than a third. Sydney and Brisbane houses are overvalued by close to 50%. So when you have a seriously overvalued asset, that leaves you vulnerable to having a crash. But you always need a trigger. And in Australia's case, Gerard Minack, along with a lot of other economists, believes that that trigger would need to be a steep rise in the unemployment rate. And the reason's simple. Unemployed people can't keep paying their mortgage. They have to sell, or they get kicked out of their home by the bank. That pushes prices down, and when you get job losses and house prices starting to fall, a lot of other people get scared and they cut back on spending, which leads to more businesses cost cutting and then more job losses. Failing businesses and defaulting home loans and increased job losses mean banks cutting back even more on lending, reducing house prices and business activity, and you can see the cycle here. And it's the vicious cycle that countries like Ireland, the US and New Zealand have been through in their housing crashes.
So what might trigger a steep rise in unemployment here that could lead to a crash?
Australia's very dependent on commodity exports for our national income, so that is one big risk. China's economy could tank and reduce demand for our iron ore, coal and LNG. Another trigger could be resurgent inflation, whether globally or domestically or both, that could force the Reserve Bank to stop cutting interest rates and maybe even start taking them back up again. So there's all these risks that are just sitting there in the background, and one adverse global shock could be the trigger that sets them off.
But just to clarify, we have never had a crash here before, have we?
Well, not since the Great Depression.
Right,
so in modern history, we have not had a housing crash. We have had corrections, and some of those have been pretty big, but the biggest of those downturns have been basically less than 10% fall in house prices from peak to trough.
Okay, so Michael, what's the message then for young people who are actually hoping for a housing crash?
Well, the first is don't hold your breath. While the conditions for Australian housing to crash have been around for about the last 2 decades, it still hasn't happened. Now, every time we've come close, interest rates have been slashed, governments have dished out stimulus or grants to first home buyers, and the whole ship has kept steaming along. And Colm Harmon has a warning for people who are so eager to bring on a housing crash.
Be careful what you wish for, because a property crash causes very structural damage to the economy. It causes your banking sector to clamp down. It causes lending to dry up. So even if you find a house that's cheaper, you may not get a mortgage to buy it.
All right, so if a crash isn't the answer to getting more people and young people into the housing market here, then what is?
Well, like Colm Harmon, most economists say supply. Supply. Just build more homes.
Yeah.
But there are some very real barriers to just building more homes, and we'll explore those in the next episode when we look at how Australia could try and free itself from being held hostage to housing.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Sam.
That's the ABC's business editor, Michael Janda. He returns tomorrow with Housing Hostages Episode 5, The Supply Solution. Our series producer is Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody, with with additional production by Sydney Peed and Adair Shepherd. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. Please subscribe or follow ABC News Daily and tell your friends about us. To get in touch with the team, email us on abcnews.daily@abc.net.au. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Jan Fran, and if you're listening to ABC News Daily, I have a feeling you're going to enjoy listening to our new podcast too. It's called Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront, and it'll take you behind one of the biggest industrial showdowns in Australia's history. We're talking about that day in April 1998, when security guards wearing balaclavas and wielding Alsatians kicked 1,400 workers from their jobs on the docks. What led up to that moment? Almost has to be heard to be believed. So make sure you listen to Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront. To find it, search for Rewind on the ABC Listen app.